My parents kicked me out of the house because I didn't choose the career they wanted. Are you serious? My father yelled. All normal guys go into engineering or business, and you want to dig in the dirt. But now I'm a millionaire, and they realize just how wrong they were about me. Look, I get it. Most parents want their kids to have stable careers, right? But my folks took it to a whole different level. I'm talking about the kind of parents who had my entire life mapped out before I could even tie my shoelaces. Dad was this old-school engineer who worked for Boeing for 30 years, and Mom was in accounting at some big corporate firm. They lived and breathed spreadsheets and safety nets. So there I was, 21 years old, sitting in our cramped kitchen in suburban Seattle, trying to explain why I wanted to study agronomy instead of following their master plan. The tension in that room was thicker than my mom's famous gravy. Dad kept pacing around like a caged tiger, and Mom just sat there with her arms crossed, giving me that look that could freeze hell over. The thing is, I'd always been different from them. While other kids were playing video games, I was out in our tiny backyard trying to grow tomatoes that actually tasted like something. I read books about sustainable farming, watched documentaries about regenerative agriculture, and honestly got more excited about soil composition than most guys my age got about sports cars. My parents thought I'd lost my mind. They kept throwing around phrases like practical career and financial security like they were magic spells that would somehow change my passion. Dad would corner me at dinner and start rattling off starting salaries for different engineering fields. Mom would leave printouts of business school applications on my desk. It was like living in a career counseling prison. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in March. I just got my acceptance letter from the agricultural program at Washington State University, and I was actually excited about it. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd see how happy this made me and give me their blessing. Boy, was I wrong. I walked into the living room where they were watching some boring financial news program, and I showed them the letter. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad turned off the TV with this slow, deliberate movement that made my stomach drop. Mom looked at the letter like it was contaminated with some deadly disease. That's when Dad exploded. He started yelling about how I was throwing my life away, how agriculture was a dying industry, and how I'd end up broke and living in their basement forever. Mom chimed in with statistics about farm failures and how I was being selfish and unrealistic. They tag-teamed me for what felt like hours, taking turns explaining why my dreams were stupid. The worst part wasn't even the yelling. It was when Dad looked me straight in the eye and said I was a disappointment, that I was wasting all the opportunities they'd worked so hard to give me. Mom nodded along like she was agreeing with a sermon at church. That's when something inside me just snapped. I told them I was going to pursue agriculture, whether they liked it or not. I was an adult. I was paying my own tuition, and they couldn't control my life anymore. Dad's face went red as a fire truck, and he started in with the ultimatum. Either I change my major to something respectable, or I could find somewhere else to live. I called his bluff. Big mistake. Or maybe the best decision I ever made. I'm still not sure which. Within a week, my stuff was packed in garbage bags and loaded into my beat-up Honda Civic. Mom stood in the doorway crying, but she didn't try to stop Dad from kicking me out. I guess family loyalty only goes so far when it comes to their idea of success. The last thing Dad said to me was that I'd come crawling back within 6 months, begging for their help. I had exactly $3,000 in my savings account. $3,000. That was supposed to cover my rent, food, tuition, and everything else until I could figure out how to make this work. In Seattle, that might get you a cardboard box under a bridge if you're lucky. But here's the thing about being young and stubborn. Sometimes stupid decisions lead to incredible opportunities. I started looking at cheap places to live, and I mean really cheap. We're talking about the kind of places where you check for bullet holes before you sign a lease. That's when I stumbled across this ad on Craigslist for a trailer in rural Texas. The guy selling it was some old rancher who needed to get rid of it fast because he was moving to a retirement home. The pictures looked rough. This thing was older than disco and had seen better decades. But it was only $1,500, and it came with a small plot of land that I could rent for practically nothing. I called the guy, and his voice sounded like he'd been smoking cigarettes since the Eisenhower administration. He explained that the trailer had been sitting empty for about 2 years, and he just wanted it gone. No background checks, no credit requirements, no nosy landlords asking about my life choices. It was perfect for someone who'd just been disowned by his family for wanting to grow vegetables. So I did what any rational person would do. I loaded up my Honda with everything I owned, withdrew my remaining money from the bank, and drove 18 hours straight to the middle of nowhere, Texas. My parents thought I was studying engineering. Instead, I was about to become a hermit, living in a metal box in cattle country. The drive down was surreal. I kept expecting my phone to ring with Mom calling to apologize, or Dad texting to say they'd changed their minds. But nothing, just mile after mile of highway, and the slowly dawning realization that I was completely on my own for the first time in my life. When I finally pulled up the property, I almost turned around and drove straight back to Seattle. This wasn't just a fixer-upper. It was more like a disaster on wheels that someone had forgotten hauled to the junkyard. The siding was faded and dented, the steps were wobbly, and there was a tarp covered what I assumed was a hole in the roof. But the land around it was beautiful. Rolling hills covered in wildflowers, rich soil that hadn't been poisoned by chemicals, and more space than I'd ever had to work with. I could already picture rows of organic vegetables, maybe a small greenhouse, perhaps even some fruit trees down the line. The old rancher, whose name was Earl, met me at the property with a handshake that could crack walnuts. He was straight out of central casting for a Western movie, boots, hat, and a mustache that belonged to a museum. He walked me around the trailer, pointing out its features with the enthusiasm of a used car salesman. The inside was actually better than I'd expected. It was tiny, sure, but it was clean and functional. The previous owner had left some furniture, basic appliances, and even some personal items in the closets and cabinets. Earl said I could keep whatever I wanted and throw out the rest. As I handed over the cash, Earl looked at me with this knowing expression. He asked what a young guy from Seattle was doing buying a trailer in the middle of Texas ranch country. When I told him about my agriculture dreams and the situation with my parents, he just nodded and said that sometimes the best fertilizer for success is a little family rejection. That first night, lying on a mattress that had probably seen 3 decades of use, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. The silence was overwhelming after years of city noise, and the reality of my situation started to sink in. I was broke, alone, and living in a trailer that looked like it had survived several natural disasters. But there was also something liberating about it. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I wanted to do. No one was telling me to be practical or realistic. No one was comparing me to my engineer cousins or my MBA neighbor's kid. I spent the next few days cleaning out the trailer and organizing my new life. That's when I started finding things that the previous owner had left behind. Most of it was junk. Old magazines, clothes that smelled like mothballs, kitchen gadgets from the Carter administration. But in the back of the bedroom closet, I found something that would change everything. It was an old wooden box, about the size of a small suitcase, wrapped in a dusty blanket. At first, I almost threw it out with the rest of the junk. But something about it caught my attention. The wood was beautiful, hand-carved with intricate patterns. It had a weight to it that suggested something important was inside. When I opened it, I found what looked like an old guitar and some kind of notebook filled with handwritten pages. The guitar was in pretty rough shape, but even I could tell it was something special. The notebook was full of song lyrics and musical notations in cramped handwriting that was hard to read. At the time, I figured it was just some old cowboy's hobby collection. Maybe the previous tenant had been a weekend musician or something. I set the box aside and went back to planning my new life as a sustainable farmer. I had no idea that I just discovered something that would make my parents' worst fears about my career choices look absolutely ridiculous. But that's a story for another day. First, I had to figure out how to turn 1,500 square feet of Texas dirt into the foundation of my agricultural empire. So there I was, staring at this old wooden box like it held the secret to the universe. Spoiler alert, it kind of did, but I was too focused on my farming dreams to realize it at the time. The guitar inside looked ancient. I'm talking about the kind of wear that comes from decades of actual use, not some fake distressing they do in guitar stores to make instruments look vintage. The wood had this deep, rich patina that only comes with age, and there were scratches and dings all over it that told stories I couldn't even imagine. I picked it up carefully, half expecting it to fall apart in my hands. It was heavier than I expected, solid wood through and through. There was a label inside to the sound hole, but the writing was so faded I couldn't make out much except what looked like Gibson and some numbers. I'd never been much of a musician. My parents made sure I focused on practical skills instead of creative ones, so it was basically just a pretty piece of furniture to me. The notebook was even more intriguing. Page after page of handwritten lyrics and musical notations, all in the same cramped handwriting. Some pages were yellow with age, others had coffee stains or water damage. It looked like someone's life work, their personal collection of songs and ideas. I flipped through it randomly, trying to decipher the handwriting. Most of it was hard to read, but I caught fragments here and there. Lines about prison, heartbreak, redemption, the struggles of working-class life. Pretty typical country music stuff, I figured. The kind of songs you'd hear in any honky-tonk bar across America. What struck me most was how personal it felt. These weren't just random song lyrics. They read like diary entries set to music. Raw, honest, sometimes painful observations about life, love, and loss. Whoever wrote these had lived through some serious stuff and wasn't afraid to put it all down on paper. There were also some loose papers stuck between the pages. Old letters, mostly, and a few photographs. The letters were addressed to someone named JR, and they seemed to be from family members and friends. The photos showed a tall, dark-haired man in various settings, some casual shots, others that looked more professional, like publicity photos. I'll admit, the guy in the photos looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place him. You know how it is when you see someone and think you might know them from somewhere, but you can't quite remember where. That was the feeling I got looking at those old pictures. At the time, I was way more concerned with practical matters, like figuring out how to turn my tiny patch of Texas dirt into something that could actually support me financially. I had about $1,500 left after buying the trailer, and that had to stretch until I could get some kind of income going. I spent most of my first week just getting the basics sorted out. Finding the nearest grocery store, which was a 40-minute drive, by the way, getting the electricity transferred to my name, figuring out where to buy seeds and basic farming supplies. The guitar and notebook got pushed to the back of my mind while I dealt with real-world survival. But every night, when I was too tired to do anything else, I'd find myself pulling out that notebook and trying to read more of those handwritten pages. It became like a bedtime routine. I'd make some cheap dinner, sit in my rickety folding chair, and try to decode another page or two of lyrics. Some of the songs were surprisingly good. I mean, I'm no music expert, but even I could tell that whoever wrote these had real talent. The lyrics had depth, the kind of storytelling that made you feel like you were right there in the middle of whatever drama was being described. There was one song in particular that caught my attention. It was about a man who'd made mistakes in his youth and was trying to make amends later in life. The chorus kept repeating something about finding redemption through honest work and treating people right. It spoke to me, you know? Here I was, trying to prove my worth after being rejected by my own family. I started wondering about the person who'd written all this. Had they been a professional musician? A weekend songwriter? Just someone who liked to put their thoughts to music? The trailer had been empty for 2 years, according to Earl. So whoever owned these things was long gone. After about 2 weeks of living in the trailer, I decided I needed to start connecting with the local community. I couldn't survive as a complete hermit, and I figured I might need help from neighbors if I was going to make farming work. Plus, I was getting a little stir-crazy with just the cows and wildflowers for company. I drove into the nearest town, which was basically a main street with a few shops, a diner, and a gas station. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and strangers get noticed immediately. I grabbed lunch at the diner and struck up a conversation with the waitress, hoping to get some local intel about farming in the area. She was friendly enough, typical small-town hospitality. Asked me what brought me to their little corner of nowhere, and I gave her the short version. Young guy from Seattle trying to start an organic farm. She seemed genuinely interested and mentioned that there were a few other people in the area doing similar things. That's when I mentioned a trailer I'd bought from Earl, and her whole demeanor changed. Her eyes got wide, and she asked if I'd found anything interesting when I moved in. When I mentioned a guitar and notebook, she practically dropped her coffee pot. Turns out, the guy who used to live in that trailer had quite a reputation in town. She wouldn't say much. Small towns are funny about gossip with strangers, but she hinted that he'd been some kind of musician who'd fallen on hard times. She suggested I talk to old Pete at the music store if I wanted to know more about what I'd found. Now I was curious. I mean, I'd been treating these items like interesting antiques, but maybe there was more to the story. After lunch, I walked down to Pete's music corner, which was squeezed between the hardware store and a place that sold farm equipment. Old Pete looked exactly like you'd expect a small-town music store owner to look. Long gray hair, weathered hands, and the kind of knowledge that comes from a lifetime of dealing with instruments. I brought the guitar with me, carefully wrapped in an old blanket, and asked if he could tell me anything about it. The moment he saw it, his whole attitude changed. He handled it like it was made of glass, examining every inch with the kind of attention a doctor gives a patient. He kept muttering things under his breath, pointing out details I completely missed. After what felt like forever, he looked up at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Part excitement, part disbelief, part something that might have been respect. He asked where I'd gotten it, and when I explained about the trailer, he nodded slowly like pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. That's when he told me something that made my stomach drop and my heart race at the same time. This wasn't just any old guitar. This was something special. Something that could potentially change my entire situation if I was willing to dig deeper into its history. But he also warned me that knowledge like this comes with complications. Once you know what you're holding, you can't unknow it. And sometimes valuable things attract the wrong kind of attention from the right kind of people. I should have listened to that warning more carefully. Old Pete's hands were literally shaking as he examined that guitar. I'm not exaggerating. This guy who probably handled thousands of instruments in his lifetime was treating my find like it was the holy grail of country music. He kept pointing out details I'd never noticed. The specific grain pattern in the wood, the way the neck was shaped, tiny manufacturing marks that apparently meant something significant. To me, it still looked like an old guitar that had seen better days. To Pete, it was apparently some kind of archaeological treasure. Finally, he set it down gently and looked at me with a serious expression. He asked if I knew what a 1959 Gibson J 200 was worth in good condition. When I shrugged, he pulled out his phone and started showing me auction results from guitar collector websites. The numbers he was showing me had way too many zeros for my brain to process properly. But that wasn't even the crazy part. Pete asked to see the notebook I'd mentioned, so I ran back to the trailer and grabbed it. When I returned, he started flipping through those handwritten pages with the same reverent care he'd shown the guitar. His eyes kept getting wider with each page he turned. That's when he dropped the bombshell. The handwriting in that notebook wasn't just some random cowboy's hobby songwriting. According to Pete, it looked remarkably similar to Johnny Cash's personal writing style. Not his autographs or public signatures, but his private notes and personal compositions. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud. Here's this small-town music store owner telling me that I'd accidentally stumbled across unreleased Johnny Cash material. It sounded like the plot of a bad made-for-TV movie. There was no way the Man in Black's lost songs were sitting in my crappy trailer in the middle of nowhere, Texas. But Pete wasn't joking. He started pulling out reference books, showing me examples of Cash's known handwriting, pointing out similarities in the letter formations and writing patterns. The more he showed me, the less funny it seemed, and the more my hands started sweating. He explained that Cash was known for writing constantly, jotting down lyrics and song ideas wherever he went. There were stories of notebooks full of unreleased material that had been lost or scattered over the years. If this was authentic, it would be like finding a lost chapter of American music history. The photographs tucked between the pages suddenly made sense. That tall, dark-haired man I'd recognized but couldn't place. It was Johnny Cash, decades younger than in his famous later photos. These weren't publicity shots. They were personal pictures, the kind you'd keep in a private collection. Pete suggested I take everything to a professional appraiser in Dallas, someone who specialized in music memorabilia authentication. He gave me a name and warned me to be extremely careful about who I told about this discovery. Word spreads fast in the collector world, and not everyone has honest intentions. The drive to Dallas felt surreal. Here I was, a broke college dropout with a car full of potentially priceless artifacts, heading to meet some expert who might tell me I was either crazy or incredibly lucky. I kept the guitar in the back seat, wrapped in every blanket I could find, treating it like I was transporting plutonium. The appraiser's office was in a nondescript building that looked more like an accounting firm than a place that dealt with music history. But inside, the walls were covered with framed photographs of famous musicians, platinum records, and instruments that probably cost more than most people's houses. Dr. Sarah Chin was nothing like what I expected, instead of some dusty old professor type. She was probably in her 40s, sharp as a razor, and clearly knew her stuff. She'd written books about music authentication, consulted for major auction houses, and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless about forgeries. When I showed her what I'd found, her professional poker face cracked just slightly. She spent over 3 hours examining everything: the guitar, the notebook, the photographs, even some of the loose papers I brought along. She used magnifying glasses, UV lights, and other equipment I couldn't even identify. The verdict was better than I'd dared to hope, and scarier than I'd imagined. The guitar was authentic, a 1959 Gibson J, 200 in what collectors call player condition. Not perfect, but genuine and extremely valuable. The notebook contained what appeared to be legitimate, unreleased Johnny Cash compositions, probably from the early 1970s based on the paper and ink analysis. Dr. Chin explained that authentication in the music world is incredibly complex. Just because something appears authentic doesn't mean you own it outright. There are questions of provenance, estate rights, and legal ownership that can get messy fast. She recommended I contact a lawyer who specialized in music industry disputes. But she also gave me rough estimates of what everything might be worth if I could establish clear ownership. The guitar alone could fetch anywhere from $50,000 to over $100,000 at auction. The notebook, if it contained genuinely unreleased cash material, could be worth even more to the right collector or institution. I drove back to my trailer in a daze. My head was spinning with numbers that seemed impossible. A few weeks ago, I'd been kicked out of my parents' house for wanting to grow vegetables. Now I was potentially sitting on a gold mine that had been hiding in a closet in rural Texas. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up to check that the box was still there, that I hadn't dreamed the whole thing. The responsible part of my brain was already making plans, pay off student loans, buy proper farming equipment, maybe even prove to my parents that I wasn't the failure they thought I was. But there was another part of me that felt weird about the whole situation. These weren't just valuable objects. They were someone's personal possessions, their creative legacy. How had they ended up forgotten in an abandoned trailer? Did Cash know these songs existed? Did his family? The next morning, I called the lawyer Dr. Chin had recommended. She specialized in intellectual property disputes in the entertainment industry, and her retainer fee alone was more money than I had in my bank account. But she agreed to an initial consultation to explain what I might be dealing with. The legal situation was complicated. To put it mildly, even if the items were authentic, establishing my right to sell them would require extensive documentation about how they ended up in the trailer. There could be claims from the Cash estate, the previous trailer owner's family, or other parties I hadn't even considered. She recommended hiring a private investigator to trace the ownership history of the trailer and its contents. That meant more expenses I couldn't afford, but also the possibility of legitimate ownership if everything checked out. It was a gamble with stakes higher than anything I'd ever imagined. As I hung up the phone, I realized my simple plan to become an organic farmer had just gotten incredibly complicated. I was holding what might be a winning lottery ticket, but claiming the prize was going to be a lot harder than just cashing it in. And I was about to discover that I wasn't the only person interested in what I'd found. Word travels fast in small towns, and apparently it travels even faster in the music collecting world. Within 2 weeks of my visit to Dr. Chun, my quiet trailer life turned into something that felt like a really stressful reality show. The first call came on a Tuesday morning while I was outside trying to clear a patch of ground from my vegetable garden. Some guy with a thick Nashville accent introduced himself as a representative of the Cash family estate. He was polite but firm. They'd heard about my discovery and wanted to discuss the matter in person. I'll be honest, my first instinct was panic. Here I was, a broke college kid who'd stumbled into something way bigger than I understood, and now the professionals were getting involved. The estate representative, whose name was Bill something or other, explained that the family took unauthorized use of Johnny Cash's legacy very seriously. He suggested we meet at a lawyer's office in Austin to discuss what he called a mutually beneficial resolution. Translation: they wanted their stuff back, and they were being nice about it because they didn't want bad publicity from suing some poor kid who'd bought it innocently. But before I could even process that conversation, my phone rang again. This time, it was someone claiming to be the nephew of the guy who used to live in my trailer. He'd heard through some cousin's friend's brother that I'd found his uncle's music collection and wanted it back because it had sentimental value. Then came the collectors. Apparently, word had gotten out in the vintage guitar community, and I started getting calls from people offering to buy the Gibson sight unseen. Some of the offers were legitimate. Others sounded like they came from guys who'd learned about negotiations by watching mafia movies. The worst call came from someone who wouldn't give his name, but claimed he had information about where the items really came from. He hinted that maybe they weren't acquired legally in the first place, and suggested that I might want to sell them quickly and quietly to avoid complications. That call scared me enough that I started keeping the guitar and notebook in my car instead of the trailer. My simple discovery had turned into a complicated mess involving estate lawyers, family members, collectors, and possibly some shady characters I definitely didn't want to meet in person. I was in way over my head, and my $1,500 in savings wasn't going to cover the kind of legal help I apparently needed. The meeting in Austin was exactly as uncomfortable as I expected. Bill turned out to be a sharp-dressed lawyer who specialized in protecting celebrity estates from exactly the kind of situation I created. He brought documentation showing that the Cash estate owned the rights to all of Johnny's unpublished material, regardless of where physical copies might end up. He was actually pretty reasonable about it. He acknowledged that I'd purchased the trailer in good faith and wasn't trying to scam anyone. But he also made it clear that the estate's position was non-negotiable. The songs belonged to them, period. They were willing to compensate me for my trouble, but we weren't talking about life-changing money. That's when things got interesting. The nephew I'd heard from, whose name was Tommy and who looked like he'd lived a hard 40-something years, showed up at the meeting uninvited. He claimed his uncle had been Johnny Cash's road manager back in the day, and those items were given to him as personal gifts before Cash died. Tommy had documentation, too, including photos of his uncle with Cash and some informal letters that seemed to support his story. Suddenly, instead of a simple case of give the estate their stuff back, we had competing claims about ownership that would probably require a judge to sort out. The Cash estate lawyer wasn't happy about this development. What had started as a routine recovery of estate property was now a potential legal battle that could drag on for years. He warned both Tommy and me that fighting the estate in court was expensive and that they had resources most people couldn't match. But Tommy seemed determined to fight. He claimed his uncle had died broke because he'd never gotten proper credit for his contributions to Cash's career. This was his chance to finally get some recognition and compensation for his family's connection to music history. I found myself caught in the middle of a dispute I never wanted to be part of. The estate wanted the materials for preservation and proper management. Tommy wanted them for justice and financial compensation. And I just wanted to figure out how to move forward with my life. The lawyer bills were already piling up faster than I could count. Every phone call, every meeting, every document review was money I didn't have. My dream of becoming a sustainable farmer was getting buried under legal fees and family drama that had nothing to do with me. That's when I started thinking about a different approach. What if I was looking at this whole situation wrong? Instead of seeing it as a problem to solve, what if it was an opportunity to take control of my future in a completely different way? I spent a week researching music auction results, talking to more experts about the current market for Cash memorabilia, and thinking about what I really wanted from the situation. The fighting could go on for years. eating up resources and creating bad blood between everyone involved. Or I could cut through all the drama with a simple business decision. Both the estate and Tommy's family wanted these items, and collectors were clearly willing to pay serious money for them. What if instead of fighting over ownership, we figured out a way for everyone to get something they wanted? I called a meeting with both parties and proposed something nobody expected. I would sell everything at auction through a major house like Christie's or Sotheby's, with full transparency about the competing claims. Whatever the final price, we'd split it 3 ways after expenses: the estate, Tommy's family, and me. It wasn't perfect for anyone, but it was better than years of legal battles that would probably cost more than the items were worth. The estate would get documentation and proper attribution of the songs. Tommy's family would get financial compensation and recognition of their connection to cash. And I would get enough money to completely change my life. Both sides took time to consider it, but eventually agreed. The authentication process alone took 3 months, with experts examining every page of the notebook and every detail of the guitar. The auction house required extensive documentation about provenance and legal ownership. But by the time everything was ready for sale, the story had generated enough media attention that the final auction prices exceeded everyone's expectations. The guitar sold for $557,000. The notebook, which contained 12 previously unknown cash compositions, brought in over $150,000. After auction fees, legal costs, and splitting everything 3 ways, my share came to just over $200,000. It wasn't the millions I'd fantasize about, but it was more money than I'd ever imagined having. And it came without the complications of endless legal battles. More importantly, it was enough to finally pursue my real dream without anyone telling me I was being impractical. $200,000 might not sound like life-changing money to some people, but when you've been living on ramen noodles and hope for months, it feels like winning the lottery. The best part wasn't even the money itself. It was the freedom to finally build something without constantly worrying about rent or grocery bills. I took that windfall and immediately put it to work. First priority was upgrading from my rickety trailer to something that could actually serve as both a home and a business headquarters. I found a small farmhouse about 20 miles away that needed work, but had good bones and 40 acres of prime agricultural land. The place had been abandoned for about 5 years, which meant I got it for a fraction of what would have cost in decent condition. But that also meant months of weekends spent fixing plumbing, replacing windows, and learning more about construction than I ever wanted to know. YouTube University became my best friend. While I was renovating the house, I started researching the local market for organic produce. Turns out, the Austin area was experiencing a huge boom in farm-to-table restaurants and farmers markets. Chefs were desperate for locally grown, high-quality ingredients that weren't shipped in from California or Mexico. I decided to focus on microgreens and specialty herbs, crops that didn't require huge amounts of land but commanded premium prices from restaurants willing to pay for quality. Microgreens might sound fancy, but they're basically just baby vegetables harvested early. The profit margins are incredible if you can establish reliable customers. My first growing setup was laughably basic. Some folding tables in what used to be the farmhouse's dining room, grow lights I bought online, and seed trays from the local garden center. I started with simple stuff like arugula, radish, and pea shoots, things that grow fast and don't require complicated techniques. The learning curve was steeper than I expected. My first few batches were disasters, seeds that didn't germinate, crops that got moldy, timing mistakes that left me with nothing to harvest when restaurants were calling for orders. I probably threw away more failed attempts than I sold in those early months. But slowly, I started figuring it out. I learned about proper humidity control, timing rotations, so I always had something ready to harvest, and which varieties grew best under my setup. More importantly, I started building relationships with local chefs who appreciated having a reliable supplier. My big break came when I connected with a chef named Maria, who ran an upscale restaurant in Austin. She'd been frustrated with the inconsistent quality of microgreens from her usual suppliers, and was willing to pay extra for someone who could guarantee freshness and reliability. She became my first major customer and eventually my biggest advocate. Word spreads fast in the restaurant industry. When Maria started posting pictures of dishes featuring my microgreens on social media, other chefs took notice. Within 6 months, I had a waiting list of restaurants wanting to work with me, and I was struggling to keep up with demand for my dining room operation. That's when I made the investment that really changed everything. I used most of my remaining cash money to build a proper greenhouse facility on the property. Nothing fancy, just a climate-controlled structure that could house multiple growing systems and allow me to scale up production significantly. The greenhouse opened up possibilities I hadn't even considered. I could grow year-round regardless of weather, experiment with more exotic varieties that required specific conditions, and maintain the kind of consistent quality that restaurant customers demanded. I went from selling a few pounds of microgreens per week to hundreds. By the end of my first full year in business, I was grossing over $200,000 annually. The profit margins on specialty microgreens are incredible. Seeds cost pennies, but the finished product sells for $15 to $20 per pound to restaurants. My biggest expense was labor, which mostly meant myself working 14-hour days. The financial success was amazing, but what really felt good was proving that sustainable agriculture could be both environmentally responsible and economically viable. I was growing high-quality food without chemicals, providing local restaurants with fresh ingredients, and building a business that actually mattered. My parents' reaction was complicated. When word got back to them about my success, they didn't exactly apologize for kicking me out, but they definitely changed their tune about my career choices. Dad started telling people at his Boeing retirement parties about his son's agricultural technology business. Mom called him for the first time in over 2 years, supposedly to ask about my health, but really to fish for details about my finances. When I mentioned that I was considering expanding to a second greenhouse facility, she suddenly became very interested in visiting Texas to see what I'd built. The visit was awkward but oddly satisfying. They drove down expecting to find me still living in that old trailer, struggling to make ends meet with some hippie farming experiment. Instead, they found a legitimate business operation with employees, commercial customers, and revenue projections that impressed even Dad's engineering mindset. I gave them a full tour, the renovated farmhouse, the greenhouse operation, my plans for expansion into specialty mushrooms and hydroponic lettuce. Dad kept asking technical questions about my growing systems and efficiency metrics. Mom took pictures of everything to send to her friends back in Seattle. By the time they left, there was a grudging respect in their voices that hadn't been there before. They still didn't fully understand my passion for agriculture, but they couldn't argue with the results. I was financially independent, professionally successful, and genuinely happy with my life choices. The best part was when Dad shook my hand at the airport and said he was proud of what I'd accomplished. It wasn't a full apology for how they'd handled things, but it was acknowledgement that maybe I'd known what I was talking about after all. These days, Green Valley Microgreens, yeah, I know it's a cheesy name, but it tests well with customers, supplies over 40 restaurants across Central Texas. I've got 3 full-time employees, 2 greenhouse facilities, and we're planning to add aquaponics systems next year. The Johnny Cash discovery feels like something that happened to someone else now. It was the catalyst that made everything possible, but the real satisfaction comes from building something sustainable and meaningful. Every day, I get to grow food that ends up on people's plates, work with my hands, and run a business that aligns with my values. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if my parents hadn't kicked me out that night. Would I have eventually given in to their pressure and become an engineer like Dad wanted? Would I be sitting in some corporate office right now, counting the days until retirement and wondering what might have been? Instead, I'm exactly where I want to be, doing exactly what I love, proving every day that sometimes the best fertilizer for success really is a little family rejection. And yeah, I'm technically a millionaire now, at least on paper, when you count the business valuation and property assets. Take that, Dad.